He's not like most politicians who've got this sort of set of ideas they want to implement, this grandiose vision. Real life is complicated and messy, and I think he wants to take that sort of degree of reality and messiness and complexity and nuance into Downing Street, and that's the most interesting thing about him.
Hello, I'm Giles Whittell, Tortoise's deputy editor, and we're doing this bonus episode of the news meeting because we're joined here in our newsroom by Keir Starmer's official biographer, Tom Baldwin, who is a journalist, full disclosure, a former colleague of mine, and a former Labour Party advisor. Hello, Tom.
Hello.
Thank you very much for coming. Now, look, given that Keir Starmer, Sir Keir, is likely to be Britain's next Prime Minister, we thought it was worth spending a bit of time with you trying to make sense of who he is. We're also joined by Tortoise's political editor, Kat Neilan. Now, Kat, you have interviewed people close to Keir Starmer as well for our podcast series, 8 Years Hard Labour, which you can listen to wherever you get your podcasts. Hello, Kat.
Hello.
But Tom, just tell us a little bit about the genesis of the book, because without giving too much away, you sort of transitioned from ghost to biographer, didn't you? Tell us how that happened.
Yeah, so I came alive again. I was asked to help Keir Starmer put together, as they say, an autobiography, which had been announced and not a huge amount of progress had been made on it. And it became really clear to me quite early on that this idea, I think, had been sort of slightly thrust upon him by his advisors. It started when, he's 20 points behind the polls when he first became leader. And the conventional wisdom was that he was never going to be able to beat the charismatic, hugely popular Boris Johnson. And people would begin to say he was a bit dull, two-dimensional. And the idea was to try and get his story across. But very typically, he felt uncomfortable with that idea. He doesn't like having to talk about himself. He didn't like the idea of 300 pages of him talking about himself. He's not like most politicians. This is sort of almost the starting point of the book. He doesn't particularly want to project all this stuff about his backstory or his vision, because normal people don't actually have backstories and visions. Normal people have a few anecdotes about their childhood and maybe some values. If I came up to you in the street and said, if I just had a vision, you'd point me to the hospital, not towards Downing Street. But politicians are meant to have backstories and visions and tight policy sound bites. And he's not a typical politician. He spent most of his life outside politics, and he still feels uncomfortable in that environment. So anyway, we went to the pub, and he put the autobiography out of its misery. And I persuaded him that the story still needed to be told.
There and then, or you waited a bit?
Over a couple of drinks. I said, your story is complex. It can't be told easily. It does need a book. But if it's going to be a book, it can't be authorised. It can't be pored over by your team, because no one will want to read it, and it won't serve anybody's purposes, least of all the reader, because the reader does need some questions about him answered. And what I've tried to do is be as objective as possible. I am what I am. I'm a Labour Party person. I admit it. I do want Labour to win the next election. I do think he'll be a good Prime Minister. But I've tried to interview some of his critics and take account of their criticism, sometimes admit they've got a point, because his story is complicated and it's messy, and he's not perfect, because real people aren't. So it's a book about a real person.
I mean, I'm kind of interested in this idea of, kind of the autobiography that never was, but sort of principally as a way of how easy or otherwise was it to get him to open up? Because the fact that it's sort of been killed off would suggest that not necessarily with any kind of great reluctance to engage with the process, but just, he's not a natural person who emotes and gives a lot away. Did you find it difficult for him did you find it difficult to get a lot out of him?
Yes, but in a way it was easier having started with an autobiography, because he had control over that. And so he was able to talk about this quite raw, difficult childhood in a way that he wouldn't if he felt he was being interviewed by a journalist. And so there's quite a lot of interiority in this book. And people who have read it are sort of surprised just how much he's sort of opened himself out. and talked about some really quite painful episodes, because I think we'd got used to talking to each other in that way, and I had been sort of given a little peek inside him, and I sort of kept that sort of crevice open to shine a bit of light into it. But he is tightly bound, and there are probably 24 interviews and lots of exchanges, and some of it was chiselled out of him, and he felt uncomfortable with the process. I think as we got quite close to publishing this biography, if he could have pulled that too, he probably would have done. He didn't want it all out there.
Are there bits that he's more comfortable in talking about than others? So I would imagine he is more comfortable talking about politics than his family, but maybe that's wrong.
I don't think he's comfortable with making his family part of politics. He has these bridges back to what he would regard as his real life, his friends, his football, his family. And he wants to kind of keep them open, and that means not contaminating them by politics. If you start talking about your kids as part of your brand, it changes your relationship with them. It's a bit like I would say, if you've got a favourite book and then you see the film of it, you can never imagine the book in the same way. And these links back to his real life, something very important about his mates who he plays football with, going to the pub with his friends, these very old, deep, lasting friendships he's had, they've got nothing to do with politics. And the more they're part of his story, his backstory for a sort of public audience, it almost reduces their power to refresh him and keep him in contact, which is so important because he doesn't have a rigid ideology. He has these values derived from real people. And so I think more than most politicians, every politician's got private life and backstory, of course, but more than most politicians, he needs these links to the real world because that's where he gets his drive and his ambition from, rather than through some party ideology or rigid framework of policies.
Interesting. So, one of the things that I know I found very striking, and I think, Giles, you did too, was about his relationship with his father. And I know previous interviews you've talked about this as well. And I think that's probably what's led to this quite extraordinary interview that he gave to Sky this week, where he, to my mind, really opened up. I'm just going to play a clip now, and then we're going to sort of talk about that as a way of sort of getting further into your book.
If I'm being honest, I've always found you slightly impenetrable as a politician, trying to work out what it is that kind of gets you out of bed in the morning, or what your vision is, what it is, who is Keir Starmer, if you like. And I read the sort of recent book by your friend Tom Baldwin, and I just wonder, I feel like I got to know you a bit more, to be completely honest, after that. Reading about your mum, who was obviously very ill, but also your relationship with your father as well, who, I don't know if I feel like I'm overstepping slightly, but it didn't feel like he showed you that much love growing up.
Well, this is a difficult one. And what I would say is that you touch on my mum and my dad, and the two go together. My mum was very, very ill, and she needed somebody in her life who was totally committed to her and her health and would put her above everything else. And my dad did that. He would give up everything for my mum, sleeping at the hospital when she was at the hospital, never leaving her side, making sure that he understood the combination of every single drug she might need every day to make sure it could never possibly go wrong, what to happen in certain symptoms. As a result of which, I suppose the emotional space was more squeezed than it might otherwise have been, and therefore, my relationship with him was more distant than it might otherwise have been. That's because he invested it all in my mum. I probably should have addressed that before he passed, and I wish I had, but I didn't. I take it forward with my own children. So I make it a really important part of my life that I'm with my children. I do not want to be that bloke, and it usually is a bloke, who in 10 years says, I wish I'd spent more time with my children. If you want to spend more time with your children, spend more time with your children. So I still take them to their sports clubs. We're very, very strict about Friday nights, staying in as a family.
So I saw this yesterday, I think, and I found it quite remarkable because he seems to kind of almost well up when she talks about whether he thinks that his father loved him. that definitely comes through, that tension and that sort of almost gap in his life, but then the sort of later realization that there was love and there was pride. How significant do you think that is in making Keir Starmer not only the person he is today, but the politician?
I think it's hugely significant in terms of his drive, because a lot of this is about just trying to get out of that very, very claustrophobic place that he was growing up in, this very cramped house. 3 bedrooms, 4 kids, 3 dogs, disabled mother, 1 bathroom. I think it's also part of his tightness. There wasn't a lot of space for a teenage Keir Starmer to emote because it was about keeping his mum alive. That was what the family revolved around. He had a brother with quite severe difficulties learning. There was lots of people with great need in that house. Keir was the one doing all right. He couldn't go around and say, I'm worried about my friends aren't liking me. There wasn't room for that. And so you've got this tightly bound, almost spring. And he's bottled lots up, and then he sort of explodes out. The first person in his family to go to university. Then he goes on from Leeds after getting a first-class degree onto Oxford. Then he works harder than anyone else in his Doughty Street law chambers. He's so driven.
Do you think he got something to prove to his father?
I don't think he's thought about it like that. He just got on with it. And that's why he talks about his mother, because she was always in this pain. Just to walk, get out of bed was really painful for her. And so, he thinks he constantly talks about politics as walking through pain. I've got to do this. I've got to get on with it. There are hard things I've got to do. And he doesn't sort of indulge himself by sort of, in a way that probably most of us do. That said, there's something really strange for him, I think, in that he's gone through almost a kind of public therapy as leader of the Labour Party. So he only really found out that his dad was proud of him and loved him because he was leader of the Labour Party. He did this interview with Piers Morgan where he said that, Dad never said, I'm proud of you. And this lady from the village got in touch and said, you got him completely wrong. You're doing him a great wrong here, because I'd go round the house after your mother died and you're sitting there watching the Parliament channel in the hope of glimpsing you. And he also found this scrapbook, which I think is he really welled up when he was talking about this, because he was clearing his dad's house out after he died. And there was a scrapbook. It was hidden at the back of the cupboard, like kind of the most secret thing. He'd never shown it to him. But at every stage of Keir Starmer's life, photographs, newspaper clippings, cut out very neatly, because his dad was very clever with his hands, noted. But he'd never shown it to him, never shown anybody. And that sort of discovery after his dad had died, because he was leader of the Labour Party, that his dad was proud of him and that he loved him, I think is quite a tough thing to deal with when you've got everything else going on.
And do you think that I mean, I know that his aides and sort of various supporters, MPs and so on, have sort of urged him to talk more openly about his family, like you say, to have a backstory. And he was quite resistant to this for a long time. Do you think that sort of later discovery that actually his father was proud of him helped in some way to unlock the door?
I think you see from that clip, and it's certainly true from the interviews I did, it's still quite difficult for him. He's a hard man in politics. He's tough. He's pretty ruthless. I mean, he's actually extremely ruthless. But there you see him begin to well up. I've seen that quite a few times. So he's still not comfortable talking about this stuff. I think he's learned, partly through the process of this book and partly through discovery, because he's become famous and people have got in touch with him, things that he didn't know about himself. And he's still sort of computing that in a way. What he does say, and I think is interesting, is he says, my backstory can't be my front story. It's not enough just to say, my dad was a toolmaker, I grew up in a pebble desk semi, so vote for me. Right. I think he's worked out that if that's to mean anything, other than just, I'm working class and, I had a tough childhood, sort of fancy that. Lots of people have had that. If it's to mean anything, it's about having some understanding of what people are going through now. So he says, I can understand what it's like to struggle to pay bills because we did. I understand what it's like when you're using the NHS because my brother has had this sort of life-saving operation recently, and he was visiting him secretly in Leeds through 2022. That sense of those is what I talked about earlier. Those sort of bridges back to real life are really important to him, because he's not like most politicians who've got this sort of set of ideas they want to implement, this grandiose vision. Real life is complicated and messy, and I think he wants to take that sort of degree of reality and messiness and complexity and nuance into Downing Street, and that's the most interesting thing about him.
How much do you think the rather old-fashioned and not particularly subtle notion of working class roots matters in the election that we're about to have to voters? How much does it matter to voters in 2024? Because there's an interesting section early in the book where there's a discussion between kind of you and him, and you described discussion between him and his aides, how much to project that. And his father is not typical. Very difficult to pigeonhole.
Quite ashamed of his working class roots,
classical music,
or conscious of them,
beard.
I suppose.
Well, conscious of them in a particular way, in that if you're a toolmaker, you are like you're like the aristocracy of the working class. If you make the tools, which enables everyone else to work.
But there's an anecdote in the book about how one of the reasons why Rod Starmer didn't like going to social events was because he didn't like to follow the people saying, I'm a solicitor, I'm a doctor, and say, I work in a factory. And I understand your point about toolmakers being the very sort of top end of that field, but he did clearly feel conscious of his class in that environment.
Because of where he was and when he was. So if he was in Bolton or Burnley, people know what a toolmaker is. You get respect for that. In Oxted, Surrey, you work in a factory. And you could see them just, he felt that sort of, right, okay, you're that sort of person who works in a factory. And he felt that distance. And pride, he studied 8 years to be a toolmaker. It's longer than doctors. Mm-hmm. And that sense of being dismissed and not respected for what he's got and what he is. So Starmer's view of class is not your kind of, as simple as working class boy made good. It's tied up with his father's sort of anger, which ended up with him sort of closing in on himself and sort of becoming almost a sort of recluse in his house. It's tied up with what was going on in Britain in the 70s and 80s with the deindustrialisation under Margaret Thatcher. And that sense of, that sort of loss of pride that people had. It's tied up with his own aspiration to get out, to go to university, to essentially become middle class. It's tied up with his guilt about his brother and his sisters who he left behind, didn't go to university, who've had quite precarious lives, still have quite precarious lives. And so it's, as always, more complex than a simple story of he's a working class lad who made good. And that's why you need a book to tell it.
We should move along before we run out of time, but you say he's tough, you say he's ruthless. What sort of a Prime Minister is that going to make him?
He's going to have to be tough. I mean, the inheritance that he's got, the challenges that face any country, but particularly Britain at the moment, global challenges, domestic challenges, climate, technology, Russia, China, spending cuts. It's going to be really, really tough. The question you ask, the question at the sort of top of this hour, if you like, has he got what it takes to be Prime Minister? I think it's the right one. Because we spend so much time talking about politicians as what's the most interesting thing you've ever done? Tell us your backstory, tell us your vision. If you're interviewing someone for a job, you never ask those questions. You'd ask, have you got the skills necessary to do this job? And I think he's shown, in the way he's led the Labour Party, that he's pretty ruthless. That he's shown also that in his previous career, running a public service, that he knows how to manage a large number of people, 8,000 people, and reform a public service. He's shown how he can introduce values into quite a technocratic situation as essentially a permanent secretary, a civil servant. He still played values into that system. So I think there's lots of things which you can see from his record already, which will tell us about who he would be as Prime Minister. Probably a much bigger, more interesting record than most leaders of the opposition become Prime Minister.
I mean, I think there are a few comments throughout the book, certainly one from Peter Tatchell, and there are others talking about the fact that they didn't expect him to ever be a politician. And I think, talking about sort of his previous career, it's certainly not one that is comparable to some of the people that we've seen more recently. But is that, when you have... what his message is quite nuanced and is difficult, therefore, to get across to people in the kind of quite sort of shouty kind of culture war world that we live in. I kind of think about what he was talking about at party conference last year and again at the start of this year in terms of politics treading lightly on people's shoulders, which I think is a good message and the right message for the moment, but is a difficult one to sell because it's quite subtle and nuanced in the way that a lot of the sort of things that he has talked about are. How persuaded are you that obviously the context at the minute is helpful to him, that the Tories are sort of doing everything they can to destroy themselves, but if that was not the case, are you convinced that he would still have the sort of strong enough voice to make him a person that people vote for, not just the sort of default not them option?
I think it's an interesting question because clearly he lacks some of the core political skills that are normally expected of a successful party political leader. He doesn't orate amazingly. He can't sum everything up in a 3-word slogan. It's long answers, they're nuanced answers, they're complicated answers. He's not very inspiring in his TV persona. That said, he seems to be doing pretty well. I mean, there's a reason why he's flipped a 20-point deficit to a 20-point lead, and he can't just put that down to his opponents self-immolating or the Tory party getting lost in a culture war in their heads.
You can put
some of it, but the reason why he's been able to turn a terrifying Labour Party into one that represents stolidity and reassurance, while in fact taking the Labour Party on a white-knuckle ride through radical reform in a very short space of time, is almost a superpower. To be that radical and to bring that much change to the Labour Party while simultaneously being seen as a bit dull and stolid, I mean, that's a skill.
But you said earlier that he doesn't have ideologies, he has values. I can see the benefits of that, but that also can be problematic because it means that people say, I don't know what you stand for.
I think most people have values rather than ideologies. If you stopped someone in the street and said, what do you really believe in, you'd get certain principles, some things, it was quite English, actually. I sometimes think it's a bit like common law, which he knows a lot about. It's iterative rather than some big Napoleonic principles. Too much of our politics is about trying to make everything straight and grandiose. Whereas real life isn't like that. Real life has jagged lines. It's like England's road system. It bends into the folds of the landscape. And I think politics should bend into the folds of the British people. It's, there's this grandiosity and simplicity is not serving us well in politics. We've had, modernity, austerity, Brexit, one-word slogans. I don't think they've made this country better. I think what you need is a kind of humility and complexity and nuance. We've had this great spectacle. Politics has been treated almost like a sport by journalism as much as anybody else. So we had Tony Blair, conjuring up amazing rhetorical castles in the sky, which didn't always get beyond the artist's impression. Boris Johnson gathering this huge crowd around him as he set fire to what we value most. And Starmer, I say in the book at the end, he talks about building blocks, and he puts one building block on top of another, and no one's going to watch that for long. It's boring. But you turn your back and you come back and he's built something. And that may be the difference. That if we can get away from this puffed up pomposity of politics, we can actually get on and fix some things. Maybe not fix everything, but find some things which will work better.
But I suppose, to what extent are you speaking as a Labour Party member in sort of wishful thinking terms? More broadly, I suppose the question is, okay, at the minute...
Well, can I answer that question?
Yeah,
because I think it's important. Right? Yes, I am a Labour Party person. And yes, I want Labour to win. And yes, I think that Starmer's got something. But this is based on it's taken 2 years to work out what I think he's got to offer. And I think it's very different to the normal media caricature of him. So it's my honest view, and I'm not pretending that, I've come at this, in a sort of Daily Mail attempt to destroy him. It's not a Michael Ashcroft type biography, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't think I'm being dishonest. I'm telling people what I think. Now, there's lots of things that can go wrong. The scale of the challenge may be just too enormous to get anything done. There are problems with him as a politician. He talks about trying to bring people together in this sort of decade of national renewal. I don't think people know what the missions are, let alone that they're meant to be delivering them for him. There are big problems for him. But I do know that there is something different about his approach to politics, which I think fits the challenges of the time. Because, in ambiguity, in nuance, is actually, they're not problems in politics, they're actually the possibilities to find consensus where we haven't had it before.
Can I just ask one more question, and then I promise. I'm sorry, I've
I've got one.
Totally dominated.
That's all right. Go on.
My question, actually, which relates to the decade of renewal, is that at the minute we've basically got two technocrats against each other, and people will decide who they prefer, and it may well be for the reasons you've set out, or it may be because they're sick of the Tories that they decide to go for Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. There will be another Conservative leader, and it might be someone who can speak more inspirationally or does have a natty slogan. And those building blocks will only be halfway through the process of this decade of renewal by the time another general election comes. Do you really believe that in a more difficult set of circumstances with a different leader of the Conservative Party, that he will have won enough support from the people to grant him another general election win?
I mean, I wouldn't dare to predict the result of this election, let alone the one after. What I do know is, what I think I know, is that a Conservative Party which is playing these games of divide and talking about extremism when in fact it is propagating extremism or tolerating extremism within its own ranks, as we've seen this week. Mm-hmm. When it's trying to play games where the guardrails of democracy lie as part of some wedge issue in the next general election, that I don't think is in line with what most British people want from their politicians. And I do think, it's not like a moral majority, but I just think there's a fundamental decency in this country, which is why he's winning in the polls. Right? He hasn't won a general election yet. I've no doubt the polls will narrow. I've no doubt it's going to be a filthy election campaign and they're going to throw everything at him. But I think there is a sense of not just technocratic competence, but some values there, which is chiming with people. And I think, when people say he's got an accidental lead, and that's not fair. He has earned that lead, and let's see what happens in government, because it is going to be tough. But the missions he set out are the idea of trying to sort through the different priorities. It's not just technocracy. He'll get lost in technocracy. That's why he needs these values. It's why he needs the sort of groundedness that we talked about earlier.
Let's assume he does win. What's he going to try to do on Europe?
Well, it's probably one of the areas I disagree with him. I helped run the People's Vote campaign for a second referendum and persuade him very reluctantly to be part of it at the end. He doesn't want to go big and he doesn't want to go bold. like everything about him, I think he will take incremental steps. There is some obvious low-hanging fruit around, veterinary agreement and things like that, which the Conservative Party seems incapable of plucking because, frankly, it's been captured by the mad fringes of politics at the moment. They're incapable of acting in a national interest. So I think there are places where you can get closer alignment, you can reduce some of the cost of doing business with Europe. You can maybe get some, better degree of access for musicians and young people to Europe. All incremental steps hit.
We're not rejoining, Giles.
I know, but that is Snorri. Veterinary standards and musicians touring.
But they're not happening now. They're not happening now. So,
Right.
so I talk about steps, right? The common law is a series of steps which slowly form into a jurisprudence. So I think we'll know about what Keir Starmer wants to do in Europe after a series of steps. They begin to form a pattern. I suspect we'll move towards closer alignment at every fork in the road. There'll be times maybe he'll want to not be aligned, if he thinks it's in Britain's national interest. But his instincts are for closer alignment. That makes economic sense. One of his priorities, one of his missions is growth. If you want better growth, you want better links with our main trading partner. But it will be small steps which slowly mean something. It's building blocks.
But there's a tactical question here, isn't there, as well, which is the extent to which he may be just imposing a code of silence upon himself and his staff for the sake of the Mingvars, the potential election win. And then you have Remainers, I'm not going to identify any.
There's one here. I'm a Remainer.
There's more than one here.
Who may be hoping that there'll be a dramatic or more than just faintly perceptible change of tone and of ambition shortly after the election. Is that wishful thinking?
I think it is, because I think he doesn't want to go back to those crazy Brexit years where the entirety of British politics was consumed with questions about Brexit. To reopen that argument now will mean he won't be able to achieve anything else. And he is focused on these missions, and not one of the missions is primarily about Europe. It may be part of growth. It's part of growth, but it's not a panacea. When he was Shadow Brexit Secretary, he talked a lot to Barnier about a customs union, not the customs union, a bespoke customs union. They're not saying even that now. They're talking about piecemeal changes which will get us to a better relationship with Europe. Now, every form of incrementalism eventually comes to a cliff edge. Then there'll have to be a bigger decision. I don't know when that will be. I'm pretty certain he doesn't want it to be in the first term of Labour government.
Kat, because I'm not a politician, I will let you have the last question.
Oh, no, not the last question. I've still got so many.
Well, you've got an opportunity after this.
I know, but that's when I'm supposed to be showing off what I know. I did want to ask about where he is currently. We know, obviously, his wife Vic is very important to him and his family. But when he's in Westminster, the most important people around him, I'd love to know a bit more about what the dynamic is like between him and Morgan McSweeney, him and Rachel Reeves. We see this story that was reported earlier this week about the Quad, about this idea of creating a kind of cabinet above the cabinet of him, Rachel Reeves, Pat McFadden and Angela Rayner. Does he get on personally with those? I mean, obviously he's had a fractious relationship with Angela Rayner not that long ago when he sort of tried to sack her and wasn't able to. I mean, are they political allies or is it more than that?
I mean, I've heard them talk about the Quad as well, and whether that's a way of helping them to deliver these missions. They're looking at different mechanisms, and whether the Quad is a formal or informal thing, or whether it's more than four, I think that's to be decided yet. He's very businesslike in how he deals with politicians. He's there to work. One of his friends, Colin Peacock, says when he phones him up sometimes, he'll say, I'm just at work now, I can't talk. And then he turns the TV on and sees actually about to address like 10,000 people. And it's going to work. He likes meetings to be businesslike, a piece of paper, a decision to be made. He doesn't like to lean back on the sofa and have endless discussions about geopolitics. He wants to know, his eyes light up if he can talk about sort of unblocking electricity grids and things like that. That's the meat and potatoes of actually getting stuff done, rather than just talking about it.
Yeah.
And he doesn't often have political people back to his house. It's quite.
They're not friends then. They are aligned in their purpose.
I think his real old friends are people he's known for 20, 30 years, and he's got them, and he doesn't need lots of friends. He doesn't need to be reinforced by new political friends. I think after 2021, when he did have a team of very close aides around him, a lot of them went after the Hartlepool by-election, and he built a new team which was much more functional and instrumental, if you like. They're not hanging out at his house at weekends. When I worked for Ed Miliband, his house at weekends was like the extension of the office. We're in and out of there the whole time. He goes home, he shuts the door, he's with his family. And, if they need to get in touch with him, they'll get in touch with him. But he's quite ruthless about keeping these things separate, because he doesn't want every part of his life contaminated by politics. Because if politics gets like knotweed into everything, then you can't distinguish the real life from the politics, and you can't take those values that matter to him into politics. It's not just like he's trying to protect his private life. It's more fundamental than that. He's trying to stop his real world being contaminated, so his values don't become contaminated.
But I mean, just on the question of Morgan McSweeney, sorry, I know I'm overrunning, but just on the question of Morgan McSweeney, it seems to me from the work that we've done, the reporting that we've done on 8 years hard labour, that it was sort of a meeting of minds. So you had the Jenny Chapman gang, and you had Labour together, sort of both simultaneously working out who could succeed Jeremy Corbyn. Obviously, the Jenny Chapman gang knew that they wanted it to be Keir Starmer. But then at some point, you have Morgan McSweeney and Keir Starmer coming together. Who chose who and why?
I think it's sort of like, they call it codependency. Morgan, I don't think, was immediately convinced that Keir was the right person. Some of Keir's older aides were not convinced that Morgan was the right person to run a campaign. He's a very impressive person, Morgan, and he has an extraordinary understanding of both the Labour Party and, I think, the British electorate, and he's been a massive asset to Keir. But this is about getting elected. It's about winning, and both of them are pretty clear-eyed about that. This is not like Lennon and McCartney. This is about, how are we going to win an election? You can help us win an election. Get on, do the job.
Last question, or do you want to do it? I have one.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just thinking, often with political biographies, autobiographies, you have a sort of a word that sums up the politician. It isn't just their name. You have something that kind of you can take a meaning from. If you were going to give a sort of subtitle to your biography, what would it be? What's the one word Keir Starmer summed up?
The title I played with for quite a long time was The Unpolitician. Then I worked out it wasn't actually a word. And I thought, I'm not going to write 130,000 words with a title which actually isn't a real world, which I've just made it up. But, the point about him is he can't be summed up easily. He defies definition. And I went through lots of other titles as well. None of them really work. So it's the biography because it's a complicated story and it does what it says on the tin.
So you have to read every word.
I strongly recommend it. If you haven't bought it yet.
Great
Yes,
question,
so would I.
Kat. I'm glad I let you ask it. Okay. I'm sure you're right that it's going to get ugly, and we shall see over the next few months if Keir and Morgan's resilience can withstand it. Keir Starmer, the biography, is out now. Tom Baldwin, thank you very much.
Thank you.